All right, my name is Jaak Treyman. I'm one of the two honorary consuls for Estonia present here today. And it's my pleasure, my privilege to introduce you to Toomas Hendrik Ilves, the former president of Estonia. President Ilves has degrees from Columbia University, also from University of Pennsylvania. For our purposes, his life history from the late 1980s is probably of the greatest interest. During that time, when the battle to regain Estonian independence and Latvian and Lithuanian independence was going full blast, President Ilves was working for Radio Free Europe as a journalist. So he was in the middle of the fight and as knowledgeable as any person could be about it. He subsequently headed the Estonian desk at Radio Free Europe. From then on, he had a history of quick successions to different offices. He was the Estonian ambassador to Washington. He was the foreign minister for Estonia. He was also a member of the European Parliament, and for our purposes for right now, he was also president of Estonia. Just having those positions it's a big deal, but the question is, what do you do with those offices? And President Ilves used the power and the privilege of those offices to the fullest, not for his own benefit, but for the benefit of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, and for the benefit of the relationship between the United States and the Baltic states. Some of you may remember there was a marketing ploy that was very effective about the little engine that could. I'm pretty sure that came about when he was in one of his offices. The whole idea of e-Estonia, electronic Estonia, the virtual state, here's the man that is primarily responsible for it. But with all those offices, what interests us today, I think, is what the future brings. And what President Ilves brings to us is the knowledge of what the international system was from the 1980s to until recently. And he, I assume, will present us with some ideas of where that system, or where we are going from now, going at this point. You know, when we started off the battle to regain independence, there was a system where it was primarily free trade. It was a system with alliances. It was a system that looked with disfavor on spheres of influence. And recently, there's been a market change from that. There's been a move toward great powers, Russia and America, negotiating Ukraine with no real input from Ukraine. There's been maybe not a complete destruction, but certainly a substantial weakening of the relationship between the United States and Europe, and even domestically within the United States. We have seen things that, well, June 14th, Baltic Deportation Day is coming up. And I just wonder whether when we commemorate the deportations under Stalin, we should also remember the deportations taking place right now in the United States, with no due process, people in black vans coming up, masks on, and people being thrown into prison in foreign countries. The system is changing. The philosophy behind it is changing, and the question becomes, what can we do about it? I think one of the things that President Ilves has done, he just recently announced that he had forsworn his promise to stay away from party politics, and he has joined a pan-European party. It's a party that looks to all of Europe to address many of the issues, and I suspect, or at least I hope, he will talk a little bit about that. I don't want to take over his speech. I think at this point, it's my pleasure to present to you Toomas Ilves, former president of Estonia.
Well, thank you very much, Jaak, for your kind words. Ladies and gentlemen, it's an honor to address the Baltic American Freedom League, an organization that through the years has done so much for the Baltic states. Your efforts, both during the dark years of Soviet occupation, as well as in the 34 years since Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania restored their independence after nearly a half century of horrors, has been of immense importance to our three countries. Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, today, when we think where we were in 1991, when once again we were able to run our own countries, the Baltic states are virtually unrecognizable. From barely known backwaters of the USSR, you speak a dialect of Russian, right? We have become three of the most dynamic countries in Europe today. We pull our weight too, paying more than our fair share of defense expenditures. In fact, Estonia and Latvia pay a higher percentage of GDP on defense than the United States. We can do this because we are successful economically with sound fundamentals, low indebtedness, and deficit spending. We are far richer than any time any of us have been in our long, long history. Moreover, we are thriving democracies with rule of law, respect for human rights, and fundamental rights and freedoms. Just yesterday, I'm proud to say, Reporters Without Borders or Frontiers published their annual ranking of press freedom around the world. Estonia was ranked number 2 after front-runner Norway, but ahead of our usual competitors, the Netherlands, Sweden, Finland, and Denmark. Latvia and Lithuania come just a few positions behind. The United States, on the other hand, came in at 57 in the world in press freedom rankings. Russia, 171 out of 180. Ladies and gentlemen, that's all on the positive side of our history ledger. Lord knows we've had a far darker history and for far longer, which is why Russia sees our current success as a temporary blip in the 1,000-year stretch it has craved or possessed us. Russia has reverted to form. Its imperial war of aggression against Ukraine, The horrors of murder, rape, kidnapping, and plunder that we see ongoing as we sit here today are well known to Lithuanians, Latvians, and Estonians. But while Russia has become what it's always been, we also see dramatic changes in the West, leaving one to wonder if there still is a West as we have grown up knowing it all of our lives. Just as the transformation of the Baltic states has been an outstanding accomplishment, especially when we compare it to the fates of all the other countries to exit from communist Russian colonial rule, today we must face the fact that as we changed, so too did the rest of the world. That the fundamental assumptions that the West has held dear for the past 80 years since the end of World War II have in the past decade changed beyond recognition. I will take up the changes in three areas: Russia, the United States, and Europe. The third and perhaps most dramatic change has been in China, but that runs far afield from our discussions today. But all of that adds up to a world far more dangerous, fragile, and threatening, especially to our small countries bordering Mordor. Russia has harbored revanchist desires ever since December 1991, when the USSR formally ended. As we know well, in the 1990s, only grudgingly did Russia accept our independence, probably more because of a fear of the West than any fundamental change in its attitude toward its former colonies. Russia whined but did not object to our joining NATO and the European Union in 2004. But by February 2007, right after Vladimir Putin's speech at the Munich Security Conference, where he attacked NATO, the OSCE, and the United States, and staked out a far more assertive role for Russia, which he proved simply by a month or 2 months after that, launching a massive, debilitating cyber attack on Estonia. A year later, he invaded Georgia. In that invasion, we could already see the seeds of today's weakness in the West. The EU was absent or blamed Georgia and reneged on the canceling of its partnership and cooperation agreement with Russia in response to the invasion. The US was initially supportive, but after Barack Obama assumed office, the US cut off all military assistance to Georgia, forbade sending weapons to the beleaguered Georgians, and proclaimed the reset. An example of Europe's response was Finnish President Tarja Halonen's reply when asked, why didn't Finland protest and condemn the invasion the way Estonia had? She said, Estonians suffered from post-Soviet traumatic stress. In other words, our entire nation was psychologically damaged for protesting Russian aggression. This form of blatant post-Soviet neo-Finlandization would be the attitude of Western Europe for nearly 15 years. By 2013, Russia already tried to stop Ukraine from signing the lowest level of cooperation with the EU, an association agreement, something the Balts had agreed to almost 20 years earlier. Then in 2014, the Ukrainian Revolution of Dignity forced Putin's puppet, Viktor Yanukovych, to flee. And then Russia annexed Crimea, and the FSB and the GRU, the secret services of Russia, created fake People's Republics in eastern Ukraine. The West, however, continued its neo-Finlandization. In March of 2014, I said at the opening panel of the Brussels Forum that not responding to the first case of aggression after World War II threatened the whole post-World War II order, forbidding changes of borders through force. Italian foreign minister and soon to become the European Union's high representative for common foreign and security policy, Federica Mogherini, snidely replied on stage, "What do you want to do? Bomb Russia?" The Obama administration again prohibited sending weapons to Ukraine, resulting in massive losses of Ukrainian lives fighting the well-supplied Russian army in eastern Ukraine. Western Europe was no better, signing despite Russia's annexation of Crimea, the Nord Stream 2 pipeline with Dmitry Medvedev, Angela Merkel, and today's Secretary General of NATO, Mark Rutte, all gleefully grinning ear to ear at the signing. Central and East Europeans, Balts, Poles, Czechs, on the other hand, were at best dismissed and often demonized as Russophobes, as if genuine experience with Russian behavior, actually knowing something about the country, had to be discounted. Some kind of romanticized idea of Dostoevsky, Tchaikovsky, and the great Russian soul dominated Western European foreign policy. All of this changed only with the full-scale invasion of all of Ukraine on Estonian Independence Day, February 24, 2022. Suddenly, Germany had a Zeitenwende, a turning point, which turned out to be a nothing burger. No real increase in defense expenditure, no assistance to Ukraine unless the US did it first, as we saw when Chancellor Scholz said no German tanks unless the US sent Abrams tanks first. But given the horrors we have seen, the brutal and savage war crimes the Russians continue to commit, torture, murder of Ukrainian POWs, rape and killing civilians, indiscriminate bombings of hospitals, playgrounds with cluster munitions, the response of Europe, frankly, has been far short of what it should be. What was positive out of all of this in the past years is that Finland and Sweden ended respectively 80 and 215 years of neutrality and joined NATO, which has made our region far more secure. At the same time, this new security paradigm in the Baltic region has led to dramatically increased Russian hybrid or gray zone attacks on Northern Europe. Explosive placed in Lithuanian cargo planes, telecommunication and electricity cables under the Baltic Sea cut by ships transporting Russian oil, arson fires in Lithuania, Russian spies feeding strategic information in Poland, cyber attacks on all countries in the region, thugs hired by the GRU smashing the windows of Estonia's Minister of the Interior, GPS jamming leading to diverted and canceled airline flights. The list just goes on and on. All this, ladies and gentlemen, escalating Russian aggression, European passivity, and reluctance to take a firm stand takes place in the context of a U.S. withdrawal from, and at times outright rejection of, fundamental American policies of the past 80 years. Let's be honest, we are all beneficiaries of Pax Americana, the so-called post-war settlement, the political and economic and military order the U.S. created at the end of World War II. And in the past 10 years, but especially in the past several months, it is coming to an end. Let me talk a little bit about what is coming to an end. The post-World War II settlement describes the U.S.-led set of rules of international behavior, accepted by all but the most rogue of nations, which shakily, perhaps, since 1945, nonetheless prevented outright aggression in the Northern Hemisphere. It is premised on a loose sense of principles, the most important one, forbidding changes in borders via force or threat of force, was included in the Charter of the UN in 1945 and was a direct response to Germany's and Japan's wars of conquest that started World War II. Pax Americana ruled both in the transatlantic space, but also in the Pacific and Oceania. But more broadly, formed the basis of a generally peaceful 80 years in large swaths of the world, much as the post-Napoleonic Congress of Vienna set the rules for European countries from 1815 to 1914. This was not merely a political order. All of it was created by the United States, well, almost all of it, to prevent another world war, based on the lessons learned from the aftermath of the First World War, the chaos, economic collapse, and the rise of fascism in the 1920s and 1930s. To give you an idea of how much we depend on this and how much we have become accustomed to it, we have to realize that before the United States did the following, none of it existed. Let's begin with the 1941 Atlantic Charter, which stated no territorial aggrandizement, no territorial changes made against wishes of the people or self-determination, restoration of self-government to those deprived of it in World War II, a reduction of trade restrictions, global cooperation to secure better economic and social conditions for all, and freedom from fear and want, freedom of the seas, abandonment of the use of force, and also the disarmament of aggressor nations, which at that time were Germany, Italy, and Japan. In 1943, the United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration, better known as UNRWA, was also set up by the United States, and something many of our parents and grandparents in DP camps after the war benefited from. In 1944, the United States set up the Bretton Woods institutions, the World Bank and the IMF, which have substantially benefited so many countries around the world, especially those of us in Eastern Europe that received loans from the World Bank and also stabilization from the IMF when currencies were in trouble. In 1945, the UN Charter was created. It is fundamental, forbidding the use or threat of use of force to change borders, probably the most important axiom of international relations in the past 80 years, and one which has been signed on to by every member of the UN. Not that people follow it. In 1947, the U.S. established a General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, which is a legal agreement between a number of countries whose overall purpose was to promote international trade by reducing or eliminating tariff barriers, such as tariffs and quotas, which was then morphed into the WTO in 1995. In 1948, the U.S. established the Marshall Plan, also the Berlin Airlift to defend Berlin when the Soviets wanted to crush that city. Then, in 1949, in response to the communist coups in Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Hungary in 1948, the U.S. created our favorite institution, NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. In 1950, urged and spurred by the United States, 6 countries in Europe created the European Coal and Steel Community, which then morphed in 1956 to the European Community and began to enlarge in 1974 to include a whole host of countries, the UK, Denmark, later on Greece, Spain, and Portugal, to bring in formerly authoritarian states, which ultimately led to the enlargements of 2004 that brought our countries into the European Union. In the meantime, in 1975, the U.S. also started the CSE, or later OSCE, which again was meant to fix the borders of Europe on the part of all of its members, including Ukraine. And then as a result of the OSCE, the Paris Charter, which repeated once again that every country has the right to choose its own security arrangements. Now, I went through all that because that is the basis of the world order all of us have been living in, well, since 1945, but those of us who are younger, even I, despite my appearances, was born after that. And these fundamental agreements and institutions have shaped the world that we have lived in for 80 to 75 years. They were all set up, with the exception of the coal and steel community, by the United States, and even that with considerable nudging by the US. On Europe's side, since the end of World War II that left the continent in anarchic rubble, its answer to Pax Americana, indeed its implicit deal, which it did with the US, implicitly, obviously, gave the US the lead in guaranteeing the peace throughout the Cold War, but on its part, it agreed to forswear power, military power. Basically, the idea was, go ahead, get rich, but the security of Europe was to be led by the United States. This has been the founding post-war catechism of what then was Western Europe. Eastern Europe, meanwhile, occupied by the Soviets, didn't have much of a choice in the matter until the collapse of communism in 1989-91. But then came the Anni Miracolorum, years of miracles. Eastern Europe became free. Russia was to become a democracy. President George Bush declared a peace dividend, which meant everyone would reduce defense spending. That was the decade of Kumbaya and La La Land, peace, love, and Woodstock. We were all friends, and never mind if Yeltsin shells his parliament, won't take Russian troops out of the Baltic states or invades Chechnya. Communism was dead, and that meant Russia is now a good country and wouldn't harm a fly, let alone its neighbors. In the process, as we in the Baltic states became more prosperous, joined the EU and NATO, the US became more disenchanted with its role leading the West. While our three countries did raise defense expenditures to the 2% minimum agreed to at the Wales NATO summit in 2014, no one else really bothered until the full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022, and even then, not everyone, least of all the larger countries of NATO. The US, meanwhile, has step by step backed off from the very order it itself created and for decades urged the world to adopt. Its last major step in expanding Pax Americana came in 2002 with the US decision it too would support Baltic membership in NATO in 2004, which was actually the crucial decision that basically made it impossible for European countries like Germany, France, Italy, UK from vetoing that decision. But even a short time afterwards, the US tried but failed to overcome German opposition in 2008 to offer a membership action plan to Ukraine and Georgia. A failure, I'm convinced, gave a green light to the Russian invasion of Georgia that very year. Thank you, Angela Merkel. By 2009, we had Barack Obama saying, and I'm quoting here, "Don't do stupid shit," unquote, and forbidding military assistance to Georgia. We have seen the same after 2014 and the annexation of Crimea, along with the hands-off attitude to the Russian, German, French Minsk debacle that basically exceeded and accepted Russian aggression against Ukraine. For a while, the Trump 1 administration did send armaments to Ukraine, but under Joe Biden and his national security advisor, Jake Sullivan, we saw an utter failure to take decisive steps against Russia. The mantra was, Ukraine must not lose. It was never, Ukraine must win against the aggressor. Escalation management, the word I use in quotes, a purely theoretical construct of so-called international relations theory, meant Ukraine did not get ATACMS missiles for 2 years, and when at last the U.S. relented, hobbled them by limiting their range. The U.S. even told Ukraine last year not to fire at Russian refineries, lest it drive up oil prices before the U.S. election. Meanwhile, under Trump, too, we have seen an historic distancing from the post-war settlement that I talked about. We saw already in February 2024 when then candidate Donald Trump said he would not assist NATO allies that did not spend enough on defense and would in fact encourage Russia to, quote, do whatever the hell they want to countries that, quote, did not pay their bills. This is a profound break with the past 75 years since the founding of NATO. I'm not going to get into all of the various polemical, at times contradictory, and often mercurial statements by administration officials on the record or, in fact, in Signal Labs. That I will leave to others. I won't discuss tariffs either, though it's worth mentioning the U.S. has put tariffs on Ukraine, but not on Russia. We don't need to do literary criticism. Where the U.S. is going regarding the prohibition and aggression of international law is clear from official policy. From here, Europe can deduce itself the future of its security and its relationship with the U.S. and what the future of NATO is. On February 24, the third anniversary of Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine this year, the United States General Assembly voted on 2 resolutions on the war. The European Union drafted a resolution that condemned Russia's actions and supported Ukraine's territorial integrity. Let me read this short statement in full. It calls for a commitment to the, quote, sovereignty and independence, unity and territorial integrity of Ukraine within its international recognized borders, and the need to ensure accountability for crimes committed under international law through fair and independent investigations and prosecutions at the national and international level. Now, this was supported by an overwhelming majority of members of the UN, but not the US. In fact, the US voted against this resolution along with Belarus, Burkina Faso, Burundi, the Central African Republic, North Korea, and Russia. In fact, China and Cuba, who you would think would be in that group, abstained from that. A second sign of U.S. policy after Ukrainian President Zelensky did not immediately sign an agreement to pay the U.S. back for aid that was already donated and to allow the U.S. to mine 50% of its mineral resources, the United States stopped providing military intelligence to Ukraine, military equipment deliveries were halted, and the U.S. company Maxar, which provided satellite imagery of the battlefield, stopped providing battlefield intelligence. This has sent chills through European militaries wondering how reliable their dependence on U.S. technology is, and what if the U.S. decides to do the same to us? If until then, European NATO members did not consider the possibility that the high-tech military hardware that they have bought from the U.S. might be turned off, suddenly it became a genuine possibility. A few weeks later, touting the new 6th-generation stealth fighter, the F-47, President Trump said he would sell allies only a toned-down version, i.e. with lower capabilities. And most directly, the Washington Post, on the 29th of March, published the U.S. Defense Department's 9-page interim national defense strategic guidance, which inter alia spelled out the administration policy toward Europe. I quote from the Washington Post's account. The guidance acknowledges that the United States is unlikely to provide substantial, if any, support to Europe in case of Russian military advances, noting that Washington intends to push NATO allies to take primary defense of the region. The United States will support Europe with nuclear deterrence of Russia and should only count on forces not required for homeland defense or China deterrence missions, the document says. For all intents and purposes, then, NATO, according to this Department of Defense document, will be phased out. European allies will be promised the U.S. nuclear umbrella, but otherwise, we are on our own. Ladies and gentlemen, we have come a long way. The Baltic states have done exceedingly well. Yet the world we thought we had entered, the West of international rule of law, we thought we rejoined with our accession to, well, the UN, but ultimately NATO and the EU, no longer exists. Aggression, changing borders through use of force, is now seemingly allowed, or at least acquiesced to. This, I need not elaborate, has profound implications for the future of the Baltic states. We have not faced such a precarious security environment since the last Russian troops left our countries in 1994. Which means, ladies and gentlemen, that the Baltic American Freedom League, the organization that played such a vital role in the restoration of our country's independence, cannot kick back and rest on its laurels. We face a tough future in Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. We will continue to need your help and support and your effective lobbying in Washington. Since we are all Estonians, Latvians, and Lithuanians in our historical memories and hence our souls, we all know as well, like Ronald Reagan almost 60 years ago said, freedom is a fragile thing and is never more than one generation away from extinction. It is not ours by way of inheritance. It must be fought for and defended constantly by each generation, for it comes only once to a people. And those in world history who have known freedom and then lost it have never known it again. This is just as true today as it was when he said those words. Thank you.
Are there any questions for President Ilves? Well, let me throw one out to you as people try to come up with others. Is NATO dead? With others. Is NATO dead? With others.
Well, I think it's on life support.
Is NATO dead? Is it, or is there still viability there? Can it be resuscitated? Dead.
Should I answer that now? Hello?
All right, I'm told the time is up, which takes care of the question. All right, takes care of the issue. Time is up. Which takes care of the question, giving us a tremendous history lesson and letting us think about what you said and letting us come up with our own answers on what the future brings and what we have to do. So thank you again.